The autumn rain drummed against downtown Seattle's glass towers like impatient fingers. Margaret Chen clutched her worn leather portfolio against her chest, running through puddles in shoes that had seen better days. Much better days. Her interview at Pinnacle Industries was supposed to start in exactly 7 minutes, and she was still 4 blocks away. The heel of her left shoe chose that exact moment to betray her. The snap echoed off the wet pavement like a gunshot. Margaret stumbled, catching herself against a storefront window, her portfolio flying open and sending resumes cascading into the rain like white confetti. "Perfect," she whispered, watching her carefully printed cover letters turn to pulp in the gutter. "Absolutely perfect." A man in a charcoal suit materialized from the drizzle phone, pressed to his ear, his voice sharp with corporate authority. "No, Henderson, I don't care what the Shanghai office says. We need those projections by—" The collision happened in slow motion. Margaret bent over, collecting her soggy papers, straightened up just as he stepped around her. Their shoulders met with the force of 2 freight trains on the same track. Margaret's remaining shoe flew off her foot. Her portfolio sailed through the air like a leather frisbee. The man's phone clattered across the sidewalk, its screen spiderwebbing against the concrete. For a moment they both stood frozen in the rain, staring at each other through the gray morning light. "Watch where you're going." The words tore from Margaret's throat before she could stop them, her frustration finally finding a target. The man's face was carved from stone. All sharp angles and cold blue eyes that seemed to calculate her worth in milliseconds. He didn't move to help her gather her scattered papers. Didn't apologize. Just stood there like some corporate statue come to life. "Maybe you should pay attention to your surroundings instead of sprawling across the sidewalk," he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that probably terrified interns. Margaret looked down at her broken shoe, then at her ruined portfolio, then back at this human iceberg in his $1,000 suit. Something inside her snapped. "You broke my heel," she said, holding up the twisted shoe like evidence in a murder trial. "These were my only decent shoes, and now I'm supposed to walk into the most important interview of my life looking like I got dressed in the dark during an earthquake." The man's eyebrow lifted a fraction of an inch. "If you're truly qualified, footwear shouldn't matter." The dismissal in his tone hit Margaret like a slap. She'd heard that kind of casual arrogance before, from every hiring manager who'd looked at her resume and seen gaps instead of survival, instability instead of resilience. "Oh, how enlightening." She shot back, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Have you considered writing fortune cookies? Your wisdom is exactly the right size for mass production." Something flickered in those cold blue eyes, surprise, maybe even amusement, before the corporate mask slammed back into place. "Good luck with your interview," he said, turning away and melting back into the crowd of suits and umbrellas like he'd never existed at all. Margaret stood there in the rain, barefoot now, holding her broken shoe and watching her future literally washing down the storm drain. The Pinnacle Industries building loomed ahead, its glass facade reflecting her bedraggled appearance back at her. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and made a decision that would change everything. "Fine," she whispered to the rain. "If I'm going down, I'm going down as myself." Margaret picked up both shoes, tucked them under her arm, and walked barefoot through the puddles toward her destiny. The Pinnacle Industries lobby gleamed like the inside of a jewelry box. All marble floors and crystal chandeliers that threw rainbow fragments across walls lined with awards and achievement plaques. Margaret's bare feet whispered against the cold stone as she approached the reception desk, leaving small wet prints in her wake. The receptionist, a woman whose makeup looked professionally applied and whose blazer probably cost more than Margaret's rent, stared at her like she'd just witnessed an alien landing. "I'm here for the executive assistant interview," Margaret said, trying to project confidence despite feeling like a drowned cat. "Margaret Chen." The receptionist's perfectly manicured fingers hesitated over her tablet. "The executive assistant position." Her gaze traveled from Margaret's damp hair to her stockinged feet and back again. "That's right, 11 o'clock appointment. Yes, let me just—" The woman tapped her screen with the efficiency of someone who'd clearly never encountered a situation this far outside the corporate playbook. Take the elevator to the 32nd floor, conference room B. The elevator ride felt like ascending to Judgment Day. Margaret caught her reflection in the polished steel doors. Mascara, slightly smudged hair escaping from its careful bun feet bare as a beach walker's. She looked like she'd survived a natural disaster which wasn't entirely inaccurate. Conference room B was a temple to corporate intimidation. 24 other candidates sat in perfectly straight rows, each one a study in professional perfection. Their shoes alone probably represented more money than Margaret had seen in the past 6 months. Heels that could double as weapons, leather so supple it probably came with its own pedigree. Margaret slipped into an empty chair in the back row, tucking her bare feet under her chair and trying to become invisible. The woman next to her, a blonde whose suit screamed Ivy League MBA, glanced down and did a double take. Did you forget your shoes?" She whispered, her voice carrying just enough volume to alert the surrounding candidates. A ripple of awareness spread through the room like a virus. Heads turned, eyebrows lifted. Phones appeared, angles carefully adjusted to capture the barefoot anomaly in their midst. Margaret lifted her chin. "No," she said clearly. "I made a conscious fashion choice. I'm starting a movement, professional minimalism." A few nervous giggles escaped before being quickly smothered. The blonde woman's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "How innovative." The sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the hallway. Confident, measured, unmistakably authoritative. Every candidate in the room straightened, suddenly channeling their best corporate posture. The door opened. Margaret's heart stopped. Standing in the doorway was the man from the sidewalk. Same charcoal suit, now immaculate despite the rain. Same stone-carved features. Same blue eyes that seemed to see through everything they looked at. Those eyes found her in the crowd and stopped. For a moment, the entire room held its breath. Margaret felt exposed like a butterfly pinned to a display board. The man's gaze traveled from her face to her hidden feet and back again, and something shifted in his expression. Surprise, maybe even the faintest hint of amusement. "Good morning," he said to the room, though his eyes never left Margaret's face. "I'm James Morrison, CEO of Pinnacle Industries. Thank you all for your interest in joining our team." Margaret's mouth went dry. CEO, not just any executive, not just some middle manager having a bad morning. The CEO, the man whose company she was trying to join, whose shoes she'd essentially told to take a long walk off a short pier. "Issei, before we begin the individual interviews," James continued, finally breaking eye contact with Margaret to address the room. "I'd like to make one thing clear. This position requires someone who can think on their feet, adapt to unexpected situations, and maintain their composure under pressure." His gaze found Margaret again, and this time she was sure she saw amusement dancing in those blue depths. He's someone who understands that in business as in life, things don't always go according to plan. A murmur ran through the candidates. The blonde woman shot Margaret a look that could have frozen fire. "We'll be calling candidates in alphabetical order," James announced. "Miss Chen, you're first." Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs as she stood acutely aware of every eye in the room tracking her movement. She walked toward the door on feet that felt disconnected from her body, past rows of perfectly coiffed candidates who whispered behind manicured hands. James held the door open for her, and as she passed, he leaned down just enough for only her to hear. "Still maintaining that footwear doesn't matter," he murmured. Margaret looked up at him, meeting those calculating blue eyes with all the defiance she could muster. "More than ever," she whispered back. And despite everything, the broken heel, the ruined morning, the impossible circumstances, James Morrison smiled. The executive conference room felt like a cathedral built to worship corporate power. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Seattle's skyline, while the mahogany table in the center could have doubled as a landing strip for small aircraft. Margaret took the chair James indicated, hyper-aware of her bare feet against the plush carpet. James settled across from her, opening a leather portfolio with movements that spoke of decades spent in boardrooms where million-dollar decisions were made before coffee grew cold. He pulled out her resume, or what was left of it after its encounter with Seattle's storm drains. Margaret Chen. He read, his voice professionally neutral. 28 years old. Business degree from University of Washington. Previous experience includes... He paused, glancing up at her. Barista, retail associate, and dog walker. Laid out like that, Margaret's work history sounded like a collection of false starts rather than a testament to survival. She bit the inside of her cheek, forcing herself to meet his gaze. Not exactly a linear career path, she admitted. But then again, life rarely follows a straight line, does it? James leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. Tell me why you want this position. The standard interview question hung between them like a challenge. Margaret had practiced her answer a dozen times in the mirror that morning, crafting careful phrases about growth opportunities and corporate culture. But sitting here, feet bare and pride hanging by a thread, those rehearsed words felt as false as fool's gold. Because I need to pay rent, she said instead. Because my student loans are calling twice a day, and because I'm tired of explaining to my family why someone with a college degree is walking other people's dogs for a living. James's eyebrow lifted slightly. Refreshingly honest, though not exactly what most candidates lead with. Most candidates probably aren't sitting here barefoot after being literally knocked down by their potential future boss. Margaret replied. I figure brutal honesty is about all I have left at this point. Fair enough. James consulted her resume again. Walk me through your experience with the dog-walking business. Margaret felt heat creep up her neck. Of all the things to focus on, he had to pick the one that made her sound like a professional pet sitter. Seattle pause, she said, trying to inject some dignity into the name. I built it from the ground up. Started with one client, Mrs. Peterson's arthritic golden retriever, and grew it to 15 regular customers within 6 months. Impressive growth rate, James noted. What was your strategy? The question caught Margaret off guard. She'd expected dismissal, maybe polite condescension, not genuine interest in her business model for pet care. Reliability, she said, warming to the subject. Most dog walkers treat it like a side hustle. Something to do when they feel like it. I treated it like what it was, people trusting me with family members. I showed up when I said I would, send photo updates, kept detailed notes about each dog's needs and quirks. Customer retention rate, 100% plus referrals. I actually had to turn people away toward the end because I was at capacity. James made a note on her resume. Why did you leave such a successful business? Margaret looked out the window at the city sprawling below them. Because walking dogs doesn't come with health insurance, or retirement plans, or any kind of future beyond the next rainy day when people decide their pets can wait. So you're here because you want security. I'm here because I want to build something, Margaret corrected. The dog walking business taught me I'm good at managing logistics, keeping track of details other people forget, and making clients feel heard. I want to use those skills somewhere they can grow. James studied her for a long moment. Most candidates spend this time telling me about their strengths. You've essentially admitted you're unemployed and financially desperate. Margaret felt her cheeks burn. Would you prefer I lie? I'd prefer you tell me what you think your weaknesses are. The question hit her like a punch to the gut. Margaret looked down at her hands, noting the small scar on her index finger from a particularly enthusiastic terrier, the calluses from years of physical work. I don't have connections, she said finally. No family money, no college roommate whose dad runs a Fortune 500 company. I don't know which fork to use at business dinners or how to make small talk about yacht clubs. I've never been to Europe, and I pronounce some wine names wrong. She looked up, meeting James's gaze directly. But I show up. I work harder than anyone expects me to, and I don't quit when things get difficult because I can't afford to. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. James set down his pen and leaned forward slightly. Miss Chen, this position involves managing my calendar, handling sensitive communications, and serving as a liaison with clients who can make or break deals worth millions of dollars. Why should I trust someone with no corporate experience to handle that level of responsibilities? The question hung in the air like a sword over Margaret's head. She thought about the safe answer, the humble response about being eager to learn and grateful for the opportunity. Then she thought about her empty refrigerator, her overdue bills, her mother's disappointed voice during their last phone call. "Because I understand what real stakes look like," she said. "When someone in a corner office makes a mistake, they might lose a bonus. When someone like me makes a mistake, they lose their home. You want someone who will treat your business like their life depends on it." "You're looking at her." James was quiet for so long that Margaret wondered if she'd pushed too far, been too aggressive, too raw. Then he smiled. Not the polished corporate smile she'd seen him wear like armor, but something genuine and unexpected. "Miss Chen," he said, closing her file, "you'll hear from us by tomorrow." Margaret stood on unsteady legs, the interview apparently over. "Mr. Morrison?" "Yes. I'm sorry about your phone, and for calling you arrogant. It wasn't exactly professional." James's smile widened. "It wasn't inaccurate either, and for what it's worth, I'm sorry about your shoes." Margaret walked to the door, then turned back. "If you do hire me, I promise to wear shoes to work." "That would probably be advisable," James replied. "Though I have to admit this has been the most memorable interview I've conducted in years." As Margaret left the conference room, walking past the remaining candidates with their perfect resumes and pristine footwear, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not the desperate kind that comes from having no other options, but the real thing. The belief that maybe, just maybe, being exactly who she was might finally be enough. Margaret spent the rest of Tuesday in a state of suspended animation, replaying every word of the interview until they lost all meaning. By Wednesday morning, she'd convinced herself that her honesty had been career suicide, that no CEO in his right mind would hire someone who'd essentially admitted to being broke and desperate. Her phone rang at exactly 9 a.m. Margaret Chen speaking. She answered, trying to sound professional, despite the fact that she was sitting on her apartment floor eating cereal from a coffee mug. "Miss Chen, this is Sarah Martinez from Pinnacle Industries Human Resources. Mr. Morrison would like to offer you the position of executive assistant." The words hit Margaret like a physical force. The coffee mug slipped from her numb fingers, clattering against the hardwood floor and sending Lucky Charms scattering like confetti. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" "You've been selected for the position. Starting salary is $65,000 annually plus full benefits. Can you start Monday at 8 a.m.? Margaret stared at the milk soaking into her floor, her mind struggling to process the numbers. $65,000. More money than she'd made in the past 2 years combined. "Miss Chen, are you there?" Yes, I'm here. I accept. Absolutely, I accept." "Excellent. There will be a packet of paperwork waiting for you Monday morning, along with your corporate credit card and building access badge. Mr. Morrison has requested that you meet with him at 8:30 to review your initial responsibilities." After hanging up, Margaret sat on her kitchen floor, surrounded by cereal and milk, laughing until tears streamed down her cheeks. She called her mother, then her college roommate, then her landlord to tell him the rent would be on time this month after all. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October clarity that makes Seattle look like a postcard. Margaret stood outside the Pinnacle Industries building at 7:30 wearing her one good business suit and a pair of black flats she'd bought over the weekend. Her reflection in the glass doors looked foreign, professional, put together like someone who belonged in corporate America. The security guard at the front desk handed her a temporary badge and directed her to the executive floor. The elevator ride to the 32nd floor felt like ascending into a different world, one where the air smelled like expensive coffee and leather-bound success. Sarah Martinez met her at reception, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and the efficient air of someone who kept corporate chaos organized. "Welcome to Pinnacle," she said, shaking Margaret's hand. "Ready for the whirlwind." Margaret's desk sat directly outside James's office, positioned like a strategic command center with views of both the elevator banks and the executive conference rooms. The workspace was equipped with dual monitors, a phone system that looked like mission control, and a stack of folders labeled "Urgent" in red lettering. "Mr. Morrison likes his schedule managed to the minute," Sarah explained, walking Margaret through the computer systems. "He has back-to-back meetings, most days, travels frequently, and expects his assistant to anticipate needs rather than react to them." "Anticipate needs," Margaret repeated, wondering if mind reading had been covered in any of her college courses. "You'll figure it out. He's demanding but fair. Just remember, everything that crosses his desk comes through you first. You're the gatekeeper." At exactly 8:30, James's office door opened and he emerged, looking like he'd stepped out of a business magazine. His suit was perfectly pressed, his tie knotted with mathematical precision, his dark hair styled with not a strand out of place. "Miss Chen," he said, his voice carrying that familiar note of authority. "Welcome to Pinnacle Industries." "Thank you, Mr. Morrison. I'm excited to get started." He gestured toward his office. "Shall we discuss your role in more detail?" James's office was a study in understated power. Original artwork lined the walls, a wall of law books suggested serious intellectual weight, and the mahogany desk looked like it had witnessed the signing of international treaties. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of Elliott Bay, where ferries moved like toys across the gray water. "A coffee?" James asked, gesturing toward a side table equipped with what appeared to be a professional-grade espresso machine. Please," Margaret said, then watched in amazement as the CEO of a major corporation prepared coffee with the practiced efficiency of a barista. "One of my few indulgences," he explained, handing her a perfectly crafted latte. "I find that good coffee makes everything else bearable." They settled into chairs positioned near the window, the city spreading out below them like a promise of possibility. "Your primary responsibility," James began, "is managing my schedule and communications. I receive approximately 200 emails per day, have standing meetings with department heads, and travel to client sites roughly twice per month." Margaret pulled out a notebook, scribbling notes as fast as she could write. "You'll also handle expense reports, coordinate with our legal team on contracts, and serve as my liaison with the board of directors." "Any questions so far?" Margaret looked up from her notes. "How do you want me to prioritize when everything seems urgent?" "A good question. Rule of thumb: anything involving current clients takes precedence over potential clients. Anything time-sensitive comes before anything routine. And if you're ever unsure, ask. I'd rather be interrupted than have something important slip through the cracks." They spent the next hour reviewing systems and protocols, with James explaining everything from the corporate travel policy to the proper procedure for scheduling board meetings. Margaret found herself impressed by his attention to detail and the way he treated even mundane processes as if they mattered. "One last thing," James said as they wrapped up. "Pinnacle Industries operates on trust and discretion. You'll be privy to sensitive information, merger discussions, financial projections, personnel decisions. That information stays in this office." "Understood." "Completely," Margaret replied. "Excellent." James stood, signaling the end of their meeting. "Sarah will help you get oriented with the office systems. I have a conference call with our Tokyo partners in 10 minutes. Margaret was gathering her notes when James spoke again. "Miss Chen." "Yes, sir." "Welcome to the team. I have a feeling you're going to fit in just fine." As Margaret walked back to her desk, she felt a surge of determination mixed with terror. She'd been given a chance, a real chance to prove herself in a world she'd only observed from the outside. The question now was whether she could rise to meet it. Her computer was already logged in and waiting, the screen showing a calendar packed with meetings, conference calls, and mysterious abbreviations that would need decoding. 200 emails sat in James's inbox like digital landmines waiting to explode. Margaret cracked her knuckles and dove in. 6 months later, Margaret Chen walked through the Pinnacle Industries lobby with the confidence of someone who belonged there. Her heels clicked against the marble floor in a steady rhythm, her tailored navy suit fitting like it had been made for her, which, thanks to her new salary, it actually had been. The morning routine had become second nature. Elevator to 32, stop by the kitchen for James's preferred coffee blend, review his schedule one final time before he arrived at exactly 7:45. "Good morning, Mr. Morrison," she said as he emerged from the elevator, extending his coffee the way a knight might present a sword. "Morning, Margaret. Any fires to put out today, Quilmurns?" She fell into step beside him, consulting her tablet. "The Henderson contract needs your signature by noon. You have a conference call with London at 2, and the quarterly board meeting preparations are ready for your review. And the Morrison Industries merger, who legal wants to meet Thursday to review the final terms. I've already blocked out your entire afternoon." James paused at his office door, looking at her with something that might have been pride. "What would I do without you? I'd hire someone else who charges twice as much and delivers half as well," Margaret replied without missing a beat. James laughed, a sound that had become increasingly common around the office. "Probably true. Hold my calls for an hour. I need to review the Tokyo projections." Margaret settled at her desk, scanning the morning emails with practiced efficiency. Client complaints to legal, routine requests to department heads, genuine emergencies flagged for James's immediate attention. The system they'd developed over 6 months ran like clockwork. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Still can't believe my daughter works on the 32nd floor. Your father wants to know if you've met any nice young men." Margaret smiled, typing back, "Tell Dad I'm too busy being a corporate powerhouse to date." It was almost true. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of learning curves and late nights of proving herself to skeptical executives and mastering systems that had seemed impossibly complex at first. But she'd done it. Not only survived, but thrived. The elevator chimed, and Rebecca Walsh stepped out, her designer heels clicking against the floor with military precision. Rebecca was Pinnacle's senior vice president of operations, a woman who'd climbed the corporate ladder with the determination of a mountain climber scaling Everest. She'd also made it clear from Margaret's first day that she considered hiring an outsider for such a sensitive position a questionable decision at best. "I'm Margaret," Rebecca said, her tone carrying its usual note of barely concealed condescension. "I need to speak with James immediately." "He's asked not to be disturbed for the next hour," Margaret replied politely. "I can schedule you for 10:30, or if it's urgent, I can see if he's available for a brief interruption." Rebecca's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "I think I can determine what constitutes urgent in my own department." She moved toward James's door, but Margaret smoothly intercepted her, rising from her desk with the fluid motion of someone who'd become expert at diplomatic blocking. "Of course," Margaret said, her voice remaining perfectly professional. "Let me just confirm with Mr. Morrison. He specifically mentioned the Tokyo projections were time-sensitive." The subtle reminder that James's instructions came directly from the CEO himself made Rebecca pause. Margaret had learned that in corporate warfare the high ground belonged to whoever could claim the boss's direct support. "Fine," Rebecca said, the word coming out like a surrender. 10:30. Margaret made the appointment, watching Rebecca retreat to the elevator with satisfaction. 6 months ago, she would have been intimidated by Rebecca's power suit and corner office authority. Now she understood that confidence was largely performance art, and she'd become quite the performer. Her computer chimed with an instant message from James. "Impressive defense strategy. Drinks after work." Margaret glanced toward his office, where he was clearly watching through his glass wall with amusement. She typed back, "Celebrating successful gatekeeper duties." Among other things, the message made her heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with professional accomplishment. Over the past 6 months, she and James had developed something that went beyond the typical boss-assistant relationship. Late nights working on presentations had turned into dinners. Business trips had become opportunities for conversations that had nothing to do with quarterly reports. And somewhere along the way, Margaret had realized she was falling for her boss. It was exactly the kind of complication she'd promised herself to avoid. Her desk phone rang, snapping her back to reality. James Morrison's office. This is Margaret. Margaret, darling. The voice belonged to Eleanor Patterson, one of Pinnacle's most important clients and a woman whose personal dramas could single-handedly derail million-dollar deals. I'm in crisis, absolute crisis. Margaret grabbed a pen, settling in for what she knew would be at least a 20-minute conversation. Eleanor's crises ranged from genuine business emergencies to concerns about her housekeeper's attitude, and distinguishing between them required the diplomatic skills of a United Nations negotiator. What can I help you with, Mrs. Patterson? The Peterson account is imploding and I need James immediately. This could cost us millions. Margaret's fingers flew across her keyboard, pulling up the Peterson files. According to the latest reports, Peterson Industries was one of their most stable accounts, showing no signs of distress. Let me look into this, Margaret said. Can you tell me specifically what's happened? Peterson's son called this morning and said they're considering other options. Other options, Margaret, after 15 years. Margaret made notes, her mind already working through potential solutions. Peterson's son was notorious for making dramatic pronouncements during his quarterly hangovers. Last month, he'd threatened to sue them over a billing error that turned out to be his own math mistake. I'll have Mr. Morrison call you within the hour, Margaret promised. In the meantime, let me reach out to Peterson directly and get the full picture. After hanging up, Margaret spent 30 minutes making calls, piecing together the real story. Peterson's son had indeed called Eleanor, but only to ask about adjusting their service package to accommodate a seasonal downturn. Eleanor, already anxious about her quarterly numbers, had interpreted adjustment as termination and spiraled into panic. Margaret drafted a summary email for James, including suggested talking points and a reminder about Eleanor's tendency toward catastrophic thinking. She'd learned that good assistance meant not just managing schedules, but managing personalities. At exactly 10:30, Rebecca returned for her appointment. Margaret announced her, then settled back to work on travel arrangements for James's upcoming trip to London. The voices from his office gradually grew more animated, then distinctly heated. Through the glass wall, Margaret could see Rebecca gesturing emphatically while James maintained his characteristic calm. Whatever they were discussing, it was clearly contentious. 20 minutes later, Rebecca emerged from the office looking like she'd lost a significant battle. She walked past Margaret's desk without acknowledgement, her heels striking the floor with sharp, angry clicks. James appeared in his doorway moments later, loosening his tie with the weary gesture of someone who'd just survived corporate combat. Rough meeting, Margaret asked. Rebecca wants to restructure the operations department, James replied, leaning against her desk. Eliminate what she calls redundant positions. And you disagree? I think people aren't redundant just because they don't fit into neat organizational charts, James said. Rebecca sees numbers. I try to see people. It was one of the things Margaret had come to admire about James over their months of working together. Despite his corporate success, he hadn't lost sight of the human element in business decisions. To the London trip, Margaret said, switching to safer ground. I've booked you on the red-eye Thursday, return Sunday evening. Hotel near the financial district as requested. Perfect. And Margaret, yes? I'd like you to come along. These negotiations are going to be complex, and I'll need someone I trust handling communications and logistics. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. A business trip to London with James would mean long flights, shared meals, late-night strategy sessions. The kind of extended time together that could either strengthen their professional relationship or complicate it beyond repair. Of course, she said, proud of how steady her voice sounded. I'll make the arrangements. That evening, Margaret found herself at Capitol Hill Wine Bar, a cozy place with exposed brick walls and the kind of casual elegance that made corporate attire feel overdressed. James sat across from her, having traded his suit for dark jeans and a button-down that made him look younger, more approachable. After 6 months of successful gatekeeping, he said, raising his wine glass. "To not getting fired for being brutally honest," Margaret replied, clinking her glass against his. They'd moved past the initial awkwardness of socializing outside the office, finding an easy rhythm of conversation that jumped from work to books to travel stories. Margaret had discovered that James was more well-read than his corporate persona suggested, and he seemed genuinely interested in her perspectives on everything from office dynamics to Seattle's music scene. "Can I ask you something?" James said as they shared a plate of artisanal cheese and crackers. "Shoot. What happened before Pinnacle? I mean, what really happened. Someone with your skills doesn't end up walking dogs unless there's a story behind it." Margaret had known this conversation would come eventually. The question behind the question why was someone clearly capable of more doing so much less. "My dad got sick during my senior year of college," she said, focusing on her wine glass rather than meeting James's eyes. "Cancer. Aggressive kind. My mom couldn't handle the medical bills and keep working, so I came home to help. That must have been difficult. He died 3 weeks before I was supposed to graduate." The words came out matter-of-fact, but Margaret felt the familiar tightness in her chest. "Mom fell apart. I never went back to finish my degree. But your resume says you graduated." Margaret looked up, then meeting his gaze directly. "I went back 2 years later and finished. Took night classes while working days, took out loans I'm still paying off. The degree is real, just delayed. And the dog walking, flexible schedule, good money, low barriers to entry." Margaret shrugged. "When you're taking care of someone with depression, you need work that bends around crisis days and therapy appointments." James was quiet for a moment, processing this information. "Is she better now, your mother?" "Getting there. She started dating again last month, which either means she's healing or having a delayed midlife crisis. I'm hoping for healing." "So you put your life on hold to take care of your family, then rebuilt everything from scratch while managing your mother's recovery." "That's not failure, Margaret. That's heroic." The unexpected validation hit Margaret harder than she'd anticipated. She'd spent years feeling like damaged goods in the professional world, carrying the quiet shame of someone whose life had taken detours others couldn't understand. "It doesn't feel heroic," she admitted. "It feels like I'm constantly playing catch-up with people who had normal trajectories." "Normal is overrated," James said. "Most of the interesting people I know have complicated stories." Their conversation was interrupted by Margaret's phone buzzing with a text message. She glanced at the screen and groaned. "What is it?" "Eleanor Patterson. The crisis I handled this morning, she's decided it's not resolved after all and wants an emergency meeting tomorrow morning." James sighed. "She's exhausting, but she's also worth about $3 million annually in revenue." "I know. I'll call her when I get home, see if I can talk her down from whatever ledge she's on now." "No," James said firmly. "You're off the clock. Eleanor's neuroses can wait until business hours." "But, Margaret, one of the most important skills in this business is learning when to set boundaries. Eleanor will survive until tomorrow, and if she doesn't, she wasn't worth the stress anyway." Margaret stared at him, this man who commanded corporate empires, but thought her family sacrifices were heroic, who could have dinner at any restaurant in the city but chose small places with character over prestige. "Yeah, James," she said, then stopped, not sure how to finish the sentence. "What is it?" She looked at him, sitting across from her wine glass in hand, the city lights reflecting in the window behind him. 6 months ago, he'd been the arrogant stranger who'd broken her heel and dismissed her struggles. Now he was, what, her boss, certainly. Her friend, maybe, something more complicated than either. "Thank you," she said finally, "for taking a chance on me, for treating me like I'm capable of more than I thought I was." "Und Margaret." James said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. You don't give yourself nearly enough credit. You've transformed that office in 6 months. You've managed crises I've seen defeat assistants with decades of experience. You've made me a better leader. The words hung between them, carrying weight that had nothing to do with professional evaluation. Margaret felt something shift in the air, a recognition of what they'd both been carefully not acknowledging. The London trip, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. What about it? This thing between us, whatever this is, it's going to be complicated. James reached across the table, covering her hand with his. Most worthwhile things are. Margaret looked down at their joined hands, then back up at his face. James Morrison, CEO of Pinnacle Industries, was looking at her like she was the most valuable acquisition he'd ever considered. I could lose my job, she said. You could, he agreed. Or you could trust me to handle the complications. Margaret thought about everything that had brought her to this moment. The broken heel, the Barefoot interview, the 6 months of proving herself worthy of a seat at tables she'd never imagined accessing. She'd taken risks before and survived. Maybe it was time to take one more. Okay, she said, not moving her hand away from his. Let's see what happens in London. James smiled, the kind of smile that suggested he'd just won a negotiation he'd been preparing for months. I was hoping you'd say that. Outside the wine bar, Seattle's lights twinkled like promises of possibility. Margaret Chen, former dog walker, current executive assistant, and maybe something more, walked into the night with her heart full of hope and her future bright with potential. Some stories, she realized, don't end with the job. Sometimes they begin there.